Purpose, a caring approach to business. Welcome, everybody!
Action on behalf of life transforms. Because our relationship with self and the world is reciprocal, it's not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we heal the earth heals us. Wise words from Robin Wall Kimmerer. Welcome to Pollinating Purpose, a caring approach to business by Pillar Nonprofit Network. I am your host and active transport advocate, Miriam Waliji. I also act as the Vice President of Impact, Equity, and Governance here at Pillar, and was previously the Social Enterprise Program Manager and Coach. For those of you who are new here, Pollinating Purpose is a show all about supporting organizations who seek to create social impact through their work. Whether nonprofit, for-profit, or grassroots organizations, you'll learn key considerations to starting or growing your social purpose business in a long-term and sustainable way. Today, we will be chatting with the one and only Paul Seale. Paul works as a manager of public policy, advocacy, and impact here at Pillar Nonprofit Network. A champion of belonging and citizen engagement, he identifies and creates opportunities for people and organizations to take an active role in shaping the systems and processes that affect their lives. Paul has worked as an archivist, an academic, a restaurateur, and a communications professional, but he's best known in London for years of grassroots community development, which he says is central to all of his work. Paul believes most people want to connect to a larger purpose, and that the real work is to replace barriers with bridges. An unabashed champion for the good in people, he also recognizes that breaking down the systemic barriers held up by white supremacy and intersection oppressions requires organized advocacy, and he is proud to help Pillar and its membership engage in this work. In his spare time, he does the same sort of work, volunteering for causes like participatory democracy, mobility justice, and decent work, all through an equity lens. Paul is a delightful colleague to have and someone I adore chatting with, so much so that we joined our colleague Luis on a bike ride from London to Guelph and back. He loves dogs just as much as they love him, and I am very much looking forward to our conversation today. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Miriam, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Good.
Thanks for joining me in our office.
I am delighted.
I'm very excited about this conversation today because as we've started working more closely together over the past little bit, I'm learning more about your role, and it's been really interesting and really exciting. So I'm excited for other folks to learn about it too.
I'm glad to hear that perspective. I'm also learning a lot about my role working with you.
Yeah, we're figuring it out together. So in that vein, can you share a little bit about your role and the work that you're doing here at Pillar Nonprofit Network?
Sure. I guess I could start with, I recently had a shift of title, and I think it speaks a little bit for me to what's going on in my work. So I started at Pillar as a manager of membership engagement, and I'm now the manager of public policy, advocacy, and impact. And what I like to say is I'm still managing membership relationships, but we're being clear about what I'm engaging people in. Mm-hmm. And so my work is really about sort of identifying and creating opportunities for our member organizations and for the community at large, and for us internally, like our own staff, to be involved in the kinds of decisions that affect our work, our success, and the health of our community. And that can take a lot of different forms. Public policy work can be really broad, so sometimes it's researching, sometimes it's data analysis, sometimes it's a call to action, sometimes it's public education. But I do a little bit of all of those things. It's a small shop. I have a great team working with you and some of our colleagues. But we're an ad hoc team. Everybody has their work, yeah. And the policy part sort of focuses my work. So, recently I've been working to kind of daylight data about the nonprofit sector workforce and the care economy, including other kinds of social purpose organizations. We've done some work in voter engagement, and right now we're working with our members and the community to think about what the opportunity is to build on the success that we had advocating in the development of the City of London strategic plan and trying to figure out how to have a positive influence on the city's multi-year budget, which is in development now.
Right. Yeah.
So lots of different things.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, you've mentioned a lot of different things. So can you share a little bit about what actually is public policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Or public policy work, maybe. So, I mean, public policy is the air that we breathe. There's nothing in our lives that isn't affected by the policy environment, the sets of rules, beliefs, conventions, and laws, by which we all live and that govern us to various extents. So, I mean, interacting in that environment is always public policy work, some of it unpaid, and some of it sort of compliant. But I would say, again, it's the air we breathe. We like to say, fish are unaware of the water in which they swim. I would say maybe until it's harmful to them. So public policy work is kind of any attempt to understand or influence that big policy environment, that whole set of interconnected things that are going on in our world that sort of govern our lives. And and again, that can take so many different forms. It can be data analysis, it can be surveying, it can be research, it can be writing, it can be activism, of course. And so, any attempt to sort of engage with and influence the direction, including trying to not change something, is public policy work.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of everything.
It can be a little bit of everything.
So on that sort of vein, what kinds of things can public policy work accomplish? You mentioned that we, fish swim in water but don't necessarily recognize it. Policy work is all around us. When folks think about policy, I think it's often like a very removed, unless they're in it, it can feel very removed, or like they are kind of not actually attached to it. So what are some of the things that public policy work can achieve and how it impacts people?
Yeah, so this is a little sad. I'm wary to share this because people who work in public policy are very used to the idea that certain kinds of things don't accomplish a lot, at least in the short term, or at least in measurable ways. The study of public policy work is often referred to as misery research, because it's basically the chronicle of these things that we're used to saying all the time, like I've been banging my head against a wall, or I'm talking to a brick wall, or, So there are all these ways in which, the whole policy environment is so interconnected that it's very hard to shift. And then on the other hand, I just want to use a really simple example that people would recognize. On the other hand, it clearly does have effects. If you think about the changes in tobacco use in society. So, it tells both of those stories. It says that we're still fighting that fight because it's shifted onto vaping ground. And yet, obviously, we also know that there has been a serious reduction in the number of people who are smoking or taking up smoking. But we also know that that's taken, really 60 years since Judy LaMarche, went off in Parliament and eventually quit smoking herself. So it does accomplish things. It's just really hard to say, what interventions were the ones that made the change? Was it changes in packaging? Was it the rising taxes? Was it the public education? Was it the getting the medical establishment on board? And I think, I want to shift to a more topical example, I think, with some risks. But I think what you can see there is that it's all of those things. It's all of those things happening in concert. It's all of those things happening with multiple actors involved and doing different parts of the job. And, so that it's really hard to measure the one-to-one correspondence, but we know that there has been a really major shift over a period of time because many people were doing many things. And so I said I wanted to shift to something more topical. It's a bit risky. We're taping in July, we're airing in December, my understanding is. And so conditions may have changed and this example may land well or not land well. it's risky not just because of the topicality though, but also because I'm going to be thinking out loud. Miriam, you're well acquainted.
I sure am.
With how that can go. But I would say I want to talk about the City of London's health and homelessness whole of community system response.
Yeah.
Where I would say we're seeing a shift that has multiple influences on it. And the shift that I think we're seeing in the work on health and homelessness response is, I think it's a radical transformation that so many people are working together and building new relationships. And I think that's really important and a big part of this story. But I think another part of the story is that it's another case where we can see like there's multiple inputs. We're seeing an increasing body of evidence around housing first as a more effective response in some ways. And we're seeing a kind of commensurate shift to human rights as, a kind of understanding of housing as a human right, not a privilege that's given to you, not a civil right, not a privilege that's given to you by government, but as something that you're entitled to, and the government's then therefore responsible and accountable for supplying. And I think that the major catalyst in all of this, not discounting the really, really remarkable willingness of the city staff and politicians to learn and to act on their learning, which I think has been great. But I think like the other big input in this was the activism of a coalition called the Forgotten 519 in the summer of 2022. Yeah. And it really foregrounded the conditions under which people are working and what they're seeing. And it was really meant to highlight the large number of preventable deaths in our community. But what it did is it fed in a whole lot of information from frontline workers and how they're experiencing it. And what I would say the shift is, this is me thinking out loud, I would say that what we're seeing in the health and homelessness whole of community system response is a shift from centering individuals who are unhoused and their experiences, and then informing the response with the point of view of frontline workers who have those relationships and who can operationalize or know how to operationalize the things that unhoused Londoners are saying they need. Yeah. And so I would say, like, once upon a time, not very long ago, I think we understood these the health and homelessness response, or the many dozens of health and homelessness responses we had, as a kind of relationship between government and organizations, where government handed off responsibility to deal with a problem to an organization, and a kind of the center of the thing is a contract, a memorandum of understanding or a contract or procurement of services. And now I'd say the center of the work is the unhoused Londoners and their relationship to the people who are doing the work. And the contract, the City of London, this is what they say, it's topical right now. The City of London's about to issue RFPs to lead homelessness supporting hubs, housing supporting hubs. And the shift, I think, as I say, is that that's a supportive piece now. Instead of the center of the work, that's now meant to be a contract that genuinely supports the relationship between housing first worker and a care worker and the people in London who need our help. Yeah. And I think that's big.
Yeah, I think so too. And I was reading some articles, some reports, and Mayor Josh Morgan actually said, this is a response crafted by the people who actually get it. If this isn't the best decision, who is going to come up with a better one? And I think that was a really poignant response, because it's true. It may not be perfect. It won't be, because nothing ever is. And, recognizing the voices and the expertise at the table to develop this, I think really comes into that conversation around public policy. It's like policy needs to be built and developed by and for the people for whom it impacts. And this is, from my perspective of engagement in policy work, one of the first times I've really seen a meaningful approach to that on a multi-level, like beyond just grassroots, which is pretty pivotal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as I say, like, I think we agree on in this is that, that really critical information needs to come from the people who are most impacted by our policy environment. The fish in the water who are being harmed, they're very aware of the water. I mean, and they move on or they die.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing, transience and preventable death in unhoused Londoners. That's all preventable.
Yeah.
And so absolutely, I think that the being informed by people with lived and living experience, and being informed by people who've lived and living experience with helping those folks. As I say, I mean, the thing that gives me the most hope is that the center has shifted to where it needs to be, to where it's going to naturally have an equity lens.
Okay, so we've shared a little bit about just how impactful this work can be, particularly with the health and homelessness response. And I know that folks can often feel a little bit hesitant in terms of participating in policy work. Why do you think more folks aren't engaged?
Yeah, so if it's so great, why isn't everybody doing it? I would say there's two things. They're related to each other, but I would pull them out a little bit separately. One is that historically, there's a historic chill on public policy work, especially for charities, but it spills out into the whole social purpose ecosystem. And the chill on charities was that there were explicit laws that defined how much of your activity, basically it was through resources, how much of your resources, including human resources, how much time your staff could be devoting to advocacy work. And that was written right into legislation. That was part of the regulatory environment.
Right.
It also was, and that's sort of a chill. So as I say, there's two things. One is the regulatory environment itself that limits you to 10%. The other is that it makes it kind of administratively onerous to keep track of your advocacy work, and it's sort of easier to just not do it. Right. So the regulatory environment creates a chill. The political environment, this isn't the second thing yet. I'm going to say this is closely related to the regulatory environment. It also gives the preconditions for political interference and influence. So folks of a certain age will remember that the government of Canada in the years when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister really turned a close eye on environmental charities. It really examining, coming after that 10% and examining and trying to reframe folks who were doing advocacy work as activists and threatening their charitable status and their ability to continue doing their work. So again, regulatory and political environment, which is variable, was a huge chill, and it just discouraged a lot of people from taking risks. The second thing is capacity. So, it's a notoriously underfunded sector. We don't necessarily have as many people as we want to do the work effectively that we want to do, and we aren't necessarily able to reward the people who could do that work best to work in the sector. So organizations sometimes don't have the resources. Includes time and people. And because they haven't had the resources or haven't participated before because of political or regulatory chill, they maybe haven't developed the expertise in-house. They maybe don't understand what they can and can't do. So it's not as if, I need to say, I guess, that, so that changed in 2018, I think it was. That 10% rule was removed from the regulatory environment, and a charity can, if it wishes to do so, devote 100% of its resources to advocacy work. But having had the chill, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is prepared to pick up the gauntlet and jump into that field. They may, again, not have the time, not have the resources, not have the expertise, not have the inclination, not have a history of action. So both, both the chill and the capacity issues, I think, are why everybody isn't doing it.
Yeah.
And, this part of Pillar's role is helping our member organizations and folks in the community to learn how to do it, to build the capacity of this. We don't want to be the only player, and we're not already, but we don't want to be, the only player or even necessarily the central player in public policy for social purpose organizations. We want everybody to be able to do it to the fullest extent that they wish to.
Yeah, and I think going back to like that chill and like the lasting impacts of that chill, I think often I also hear there's a tentative fear around potentially, speaking out against, levels of government, which then they rely on for funding. And so it's like, okay, they say it's okay, but is it okay? And I think that ties into it as well. And I know you've done some really interesting things with the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction, which sounds fantastical and is a real department. But I think having some of that awareness as well, that there's efforts to move forward to actually remove some of those barriers so that people can engage in public policy without necessary fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just fear of offending governments, of course, who can be funders, but fear of offending any funder, and appearing to be controversial. So again, that chill, that historic chill, that also affects philanthropy. And philanthropy may be shy of organizations. And as I said, it's not like all bets are off. There's certain kinds of partisan activity, for example, is the one that jumps to mind, that are still highly restricted. And it doesn't mean that you can't, it doesn't mean that there are different kinds of organizations that can do different kinds of things, but there are some strictures around that, and you have to register to do certain kinds of things, make yourself known, announce yourself as a player, as a third-party player in an electoral process. So there are things that you can't do without doing other things.
Right.
But yeah, it's absolutely the case that chill sort of extends beyond just the rules to a kind of historic nervousness about for philanthropists and charitable institutions, nervousness about the folks that they fund, for folks seeking funding, nervousness about offending anybody. Philanthropic organizations also have boards who are made up of real people, and you have to think about who are the real people and who could I be upsetting by the work that I do. The Ministry of Red Tape Reduction is a really interesting relationship to have developed. This is a ministry where our relationship is with the staff, and they are genuinely interested in trying to figure out how to reduce administrative burden. We have a kind of open conversation with them now. We canvassed our members about the kinds of things that they find onerous in processes with the provincial government, and it does. It sounds fantastical, but the folks that we're actually meeting with are fantastic. They're willing to listen. And so I like to say, not that there's anybody with whom we can't play nicely. I like to say that's a ministry with which the nonprofit or social purpose sector can play nicely, because they're genuinely interested in making things easier to do.
Okay. Yeah. And so we've talked about how impactful the work can be. We've talked about some reasons why folks might not be engaging. So say we've piqued their interest.
Okay.
What would you recommend folks do to get started in public policy work? What's an easy way to kind of dip their toes in?
Yeah. I guess at the sort of practical and tactical level, I'll come back to it.
Okay.
The way to get involved is to focus on your purpose.
Right.
The way to get involved is to think about, what are we here to do? So if you're a social purpose organization, if you're a social enterprise interested in having an effect on the world and making some change, making something better, you probably have an idea of what that thing is that you want to do. If you focus on your purpose, it should be not necessarily easy, but it should follow naturally that you need to identify what would stop you in the policy environment. What would stop you from achieving your purpose? What are the barriers? What other things do we need to do in order to have the effect that we want to have, in order to make the change that we want to make, in order to better the community in the way we want to better the community. So, so I would say start there. Always start with purpose. And if you feel like you've drifted, come back to purpose.
Right.
And which I feel is nice to say in the context of this podcast, but still totally true. And then I guess tactically, strategically, I pointed at this earlier when I was talking about the work we're doing about, trying to help people understand and take action on like that space between the development of a strategic plan and the development of a budget. And we're sort of working, on that moment in between those two things in our city's governance. But I would say, think about those things in your own planning. Yeah. So, have a business plan by all means, and it can be, you probably talk about this sort of thing all the time in your work. Yeah. But it can be relatively formal or relatively informal, depending, so many different kinds of organizations. The answer to this question, like how to get involved, will be so different for so many different organizations. But the consistent thing would be have some kind of plan. Yeah. Have some kind of strategy for achieving the goals that you want to achieve. If you're a social enterprise, you need to be sustainable. You're going to need to have revenues or, some kind of financial sustainability. And, if you're purpose driven, you're going to need to know what the purpose is under all that stuff and what success looks like. Even if it's intermediary success, we talked about those long processes, right? So like, what are the steps to success? Where can you intervene? And then I would say it's always on us. There's, the big chill, there's lots of barriers, but it's always on us to go through the steps toward your own success. So, have that business plan or strategic plan. It might be an integrated plan, but here's the key thing. It's got to be in your budget. Yes. So make sure that you resource the thing that you think is important. Yeah. And that's how to get started. And that could look like public education. It could look like research. It could look like activism, but figure out what do you need to do to be successful.
Amazing. Thanks, Paul.
You're so welcome, Miriam. It's such a pleasure.
Yeah. Before we kind of wrap it up fully, can you share a little bit about where folks can find out more about you or connect with you and the work that you're doing here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a bit of a loose cannon on Twitter, so LinkedIn would better.
X now?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. People, by the time this airs, people may not know what Twitter was. Yeah. I'm a little bit more representative of the work that I do on LinkedIn if you find me there, and I am there under my very own name. I think that the big source for where my work turns up would be in our news page on the Pillar Nonprofit website, pillarnonprofit.ca. If you go to news, under news and resources, anything that I'm producing by way of writing will probably turn up as a blog post there. I do prepare a policy alert newsletter for our members, but anybody in the community can subscribe to Pillar's community newsletter. You'd find that at pillarnonprofit.ca/newsletter. And the work that we produce does get sort of digested and disseminated to the community that way. So there's another good way to find out what we're up to.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Paul. You and your bright shoes that are always my favorite. And yeah, thanks for having the conversation.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you once again to Paul for joining us. It is always a treat being able to chat with him. If you would like to learn more about Pillar Nonprofit Network and the work that we do, you can head on over to pillarnonprofit.ca. And very specifically, if you're interested in the public policy and advocacy work, pillarnonprofit.ca/advocacy-awareness. Once again, I am your host, your guide, your business bud, Miriam Oligi, and thank you once again for joining me on Pollinating Purpose, a caring approach to business. Thanks for coming along for the ride. I'm glad that you're here.